As we mentioned earlier, this one mind was originally blank, but then this thing, the aramana, which I have translated sense objects, come in and set off a process of conditioning, which is similar to the light shining upon the crystal. So are these aramana, these external objects which come in and make contact with the mind, which touch off this conditioning. This is a very important point to understand if you are to understand how it is that the mind assumes all these different forms and functions. So we'd like to explain this word aramana more carefully. Aramana is in the language of the Buddha, the Pali language. In Thai, it is shortened to arom, and it is generally translated sense object. But this word sense object probably has too narrow a meaning and doesn't quite give the full meaning of the word the Buddha used, which is aramana. This word aramana means something which is grabbed. The aramana are things which the mind grasps onto, clutches at, or we can even say snatches. The aramana are things which the mind goes out and grabs and snatches. This is the full meaning of aramana or arom, which is not quite conveyed by the word sense objects. But when we're talking about the sense objects, we're talking about these things which the mind snatches. It clutches at and grabs them. So then when the mind snatches one of these aramana, then that touches off, that begins a conditioning of the mind. The mind is conditioned depending on how it reacts to whichever aramana has been snatched. And so this is very, very important. Please understand the meaning of this word aramana and understand how the mind's interaction with the aramana touches off all this conditioning of the mind. These aramana are quite dangerous. Let's look at a newborn infant to get an idea how this process works. The infant that has just been born, has just appeared into the so-called world out of its mother's womb. At first, if the sense organs, the sensory apparatus, visual, oral, etc., is not functioning, then the citta of that infant will be blank. The infant's mind will be blank because there is no sense stimuli, sense data coming into the mind. But once these sense organs begin to function, then the mind is no longer blank. For example, when the infant is sucking at its mother's breast, drinking milk from its mother's breast, then there is the taste sensations on the tongue. Using through this one sense door of the tongue, there come in these various sensations. And these are interpreted as pleasing, as delicious. So this sense object of the mother's milk comes in and conditions the feeling of deliciousness, of pleasantness in the mind. The mind has already snatched away that sense object, And then the process of conditioning begins. And there's this feeling of a sense object or of deliciousness. And this will further condition the thought or feeling of an I that experiences that deliciousness. I am delighted. I am pleased by this deliciousness. And so here is this arising of the I. It's interesting to see that this thought or feeling of an I occurs after the sensory contact. First, the mind snatches away that aramana, in this case, the tastes of the milk. And then only later does the conception of an I or self or soul arise as a latter part of the conditioning. The same kind of process will happen when the infant is hugged and cuddled in its mother's arms or father's or brothers or sisters or whatever. There is this touch sensation, and the infant's mind will snatch that aramana, and that will touch off this process of conditioning. And the same kind of things will occur with the eyes, especially the way people like to dangle beautiful objects in front of a baby's face to stimulate it. And so all these colorful and interesting shapes will be snatched by the baby's citta. And the same happens with sounds and smells and even thoughts. So the originally blank mind of the infant is conditioned in this way by this snatching of these sense objects. And then the mind reacts. It begins to be pleased by certain objects or displeased by others. And this gives rise to the feeling of an I. I am pleased. I am displeased. I like. I dislike. And this is the root cause of all the problems experienced by the citta. When the untrained mind of the infant gets into this habit of snatching away at aramana, and then falling into the trap of liking and disliking, then there arises this thought of an I, these conceptions and illusions of some self. And this is where all the problems of the citta begin. So this shows how these sense objects, these aramana, shows how dangerous they are, because they have this power to influence the mind. And so the mind, through the influence of the aramana, is always changing this way, that way, this way, that way, in hundreds or thousands of different ways. One citta manifesting all these different forms and activities and shapes under the influence of the conditioning of the aramana. So this shows the power and danger of the aramana, their ability to condition the mind in this very powerful way, which gives rise to the I, which is the source of selfishness and all the other problems experienced by the human citta. So through the influence of the aramana, this thought and conception or illusion of a self or I arises. And as this arises more and more, it becomes stronger, it becomes more attached to, the mind clutches to this illusion more and more, to the point where this concept of an I is so strong that it gives rise to its opposite, the concept of some kind of enemy. And so the mind is caught up in this eternal conflict of I and my enemy. This is the terrible influence of the aramana. As the infant grows, as the sense organs develop, more and more aramana make contact with the citta. The citta snatches up more and more of these aramana. And so that original state of blankness is long gone, and the mind is caught up more and more in this process of conditioning. This conditioning that is touched off by the aramana grows and grows. Patterns develop. Tendencies and habits become set. And so by the time the infant becomes a teenager or a young adult, all these patterns of conditioning are very firmly established. They're very, very strong and have great control over the mind. So at this stage in life, the stage of, say, a young adult, the sensory apparatus has been highly developed in this one way. And so through the senses, the mind is always clutching at things, and it has cluttered itself up with all these aramana that it has snatched up. And so we have certain tendencies reoccurring constantly. One tendency is that the mind will snatch up an object and will be pleased with it, pleased or satisfied by that object. This will condition the reaction of the mind trying to rake in, to pull in, to get more and more of that aramana, more of that sense experience. This is one kind of conditioning of the mind. It is called in Pali lopa or raka, greed or lust. It is this trying to rake in, to gather in, to get and pile up all these pleasing aramana. The second type of tendency which develops in the mind we can call tosa. Tosa is when the object, the aramana, is somehow unpleasing, displeasing, or unsatisfying. And so the mind will have the tendency to want to get rid of that, to knock it away, to get angry at it, to want to destroy it. And so we have what we can call tosa, ill will, or gota, anger. This is the second type of tendency which is conditioned in the mind. The third type of tendency is related to sense objects which do not have an immediate influence on the mind, meaning they neither please or displease the mind. For some reason, the mind doesn't get caught up in either of these tendencies of liking or disliking. But the mind is so addicted, this one citta is so addicted to these tendencies of pulling in or knocking away, that it's very confused by these objects which neither please nor displease. The citta is knocked off balance and doesn't know what to do. So instead of trying to pull in or push away, it runs in circles. It runs in very confused circles around that sense experience. And this is called in Pali moha, delusion, confusion. So these are the three primary tendencies of conditioning which develop in the mind. These three kinds of conditioning are touched off by the sense objects, the aramana. And this develops and is strengthened as the human being grows from an infant to a young adult and older, and gets more set in these ways, gets more locked into these patterns of conditioning. If you're beginning to understand this, you'll see how dangerous this whole situation is, how the mind is enslaved to all this, and how it gets caught up more and more into this addiction to this illusion of an I, of a self. Because all this conditioning of the mind is always bringing up these thoughts of an I, the I who likes, the I who dislikes, or the I who is confused. And this I grows and grows until it creates enemies. This illusion of an I creates the illusion of enemies. And then the citta has gotten itself very much buried into not knowing or ignorance. So it's caught up in this process of ignorance. This ignorance, because the mind doesn't understand things the way they are, this not knowing or ignorance allows these tendencies to develop. Remember back with the infant's mind that is blank. It is blank, that means it is in a state of not knowing. And so this conditioning, these three types of conditioning that we just described, develop. And these we can call the kilesa, the defilements. These are dirty, impure activities of the mind. They arise because there is no poti. Poti is enlightenment wisdom. It is direct seeing into the true nature of things. When there is no poti, the kilesa develop. Because at the beginning of this whole mess, there was no poti available, and all this defiled conditioning arose. So now we come to the point where we must discuss one very, very important word. In Pali, this word is upadana, clinging and grasping, or we can use the single word attachment. We'll discuss this word because you must be very, very careful to understand it properly. There is often much confusion about the proper meaning, the correct meaning of the word attachment. Many people think that love is a kind of attachment, and then assume that to not love is detachment. To love is attachment, and not love is detachment. This is a very common assumption, but it is incorrect. To detach is really just another form of attachment. It's a kind of negative attachment. Or we could say the mind attaches to something in order that it can detach. Because generally this detachment is just some kind of, is caught up in that pushing away. What most people think of as attachment is this pulling in, or is related to this pulling in, and detachment is some kind of pushing away. And so many people get some very confused ideas about Dhamma practice and think they must go around pushing things away. This is foolish and leads to just as many problems as attachment. Let's go back to these three kinds of conditioning of the mind we mentioned. There is the pulling in, and this gives rise to the positive kind of attachment. And then there's the second kind, the pushing away, which conditions what many people call detachment, which is just some sort of negative attachment. And then for those uncertain reaction to some objects that leads to confusion, to the running around in doubt regarding some sense experience. This leads to a confused kind of attachment wherein the citta is all stirred up and confused. So this is attachment, or grasping, and clinging. Detachment is just a form of attachment. This attachment is essentially when the citta clings to something as I or mine. It has this egoistic identification with something which it wants to get or get rid of, or about which it is confused and uncertain. Attachment is the cause of dukkha. Dukkha can only arise when there is attachment. When there are any of these kinds of attachment, then the mind is conditioned in all sorts of different ways. Or we can say that these various kinds of defilement which we've described condition the mind in hundreds and thousands of different ways. The citta is turning all sorts of colors. And then the ignorant citta goes and attaches to all these different colors. I am red, I am blue, I am yellow. It attaches to this pulling in, pushing away, or confused running around in circles. First these attachments or these defilements arise, and we can categorize them all as craving. The Buddha used the word tanha, and tanha conditions upadana, or attachment, this grasping at things as I or mine. Once attachment arises, it's inevitable that the mind will experience dukkha. Attachment inevitably causes dukkha. So through all this attachment, all this I and me and mine, dukkha is conditioned. So if you are interested in this problem of dukkha, then you will now see how absolutely important it is to have a correct understanding of what we mean by attachment. If you do not understand attachment properly, then you will not be in a position to deal with attachment, and therefore you will have very little success at dealing with the problem of dukkha. So please try to understand this word attachment, or upadana, correctly. So everything that's been talked about so far, you'll be beginning to see is just this one mind. Everything is just the one mind, functioning in this way or that way, conditioning in this way or that way. We're talking about nothing but the one mind. The one mind receives the aramana, or snatches the aramana. And this conditions the vedana, or feelings of liking, disliking, and uncertainty. The vedana conditions tanha, or craving in the form of trying to pull in, trying to push away, or running around in confusion. Tanha conditions upadana, attachment, clutching and clinging at things as I or mine. It's the one mind that receives the sense object. The one mind feels liking and disliking. The one mind craves. The one mind attaches. And it is the one mind that must bear this heavy burden of dukkha. Once the one mind attaches, then it must accept the weight and burden of dukkha. It is inevitable. But you'll see that all of this is just the one mind. All these different things, all this conditioning is just the one mind. So this is how the one mind is transformed or is conditioned in the way of dukkha, in the way that ends in dukkha. As soon as the one mind gets caught up in attachment, it must bear the burden. It must suffer the penalty of dukkha. No one decides this. It's not a choice. It's just the inevitable result of this conditioning. of the one mind. All this happens because of the absence of wisdom, because of avijja, ignorance or stupidity. Because the mind is foolish, because this one mind doesn't understand the way things operate, it gets caught up in this process of conditioning and suffers dukkha. But there's a way out. The way out is the path of poti, of enlightenment wisdom, of seeing things as they really are. This is the path of poti. Poti is just that same one mind. It's just the single mind. As the mind experiences dukkha over and over again, as the mind attaches and then is burnt, attaches and is penalized, attaches and suffers, as this dukkha happens over and over again, the mind, the one mind, begins to be aware of this problem of dukkha. The one mind begins to see this dukkha as it really is, and sees how onerous, how disgusting, how useless it is. And in this way there begins to arise wisdom. The wisdom that there is this problem which we call dukkha. This is the beginning of wisdom. This is the beginning of the path of poti. The experience of dukkha begins to condition the wisdom that sees this dukkha. Once the one mind begins to develop this wisdom that there is the problem of dukkha, then the one mind begins to examine the problem and look for its cause. How does this dukkha arise? What conditions this dukkha? And in this way, wisdom grows. The path of poti develops even further into trying to understand the cause of the problem. And then as the one mind examines the cause, it will realize that there is the possibility of being free of this problem. There is the problem and its opposite. The opposite is the end, the solution to that problem. So wisdom develops even further. This one mind develops further to the point that it understands that there is a possibility of ending dukkha. And then understanding that there is a cause to dukkha, it realizes there must be a cause for the end of dukkha. And so the one mind explores and experiments until it finds a way to eliminate dukkha. So this is how the one mind, the same one mind that experienced all those feelings and attachments and craving and dukkha, how this same mind then develops in wisdom. The experience of dukkha begins to cause the arising of wisdom. Wisdom develops into understanding the cause of dukkha. The same one mind is beginning to understand this cause, begins to see that there is an end to dukkha, and then learns the way of living, the way of practice that eliminates dukkha. It's the same one mind that experiences all these different things, the same one mind that performs all these different activities and displays these very, very many symptoms. It's the one mind, either in dukkha or in poti, in wisdom. Through understanding these various workings of the one mind, then you will begin to see the importance of understanding how all these things work and how this knowledge can liberate you. Generally, the human mind remains caught up in the same old patterns of conditioning which we discussed earlier, those of pulling in, pushing away, and circling round in confusion. The ordinary human mind is generally not capable of breaking out of this cycle alone. But somehow it is within the nature of the evolution of the human mind that there arise beings who we call the Buddha, or we call Buddhas, beings of the type or nature of a Buddha. A Buddha has a mind that is able to develop in the path of wisdom or poti on its own. The Buddha's mind evolves onto this very, very high level to the point where it fully realizes these four truths. The Buddha's mind penetrates fully into the truths of dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, and the way of living that leads to the end of dukkha. And then a Buddha can teach this knowledge, and other minds can begin to receive this explanation from the Buddha, either directly from a Buddha, or indirectly through a disciple, someone else who has heard the teaching and been able to understand it well enough to pass it on. And so the ordinary sentient being, the mind, the one mind of an ordinary being, can receive this information and begin to process it. And if the mind is able to begin to understand this information correctly, if it hears it often enough, if it is able to think about it clearly enough, and somehow begin to take the first step of experimenting and seeing if this knowledge is actually true, then that knowledge can be the seeds of liberation for that mind. And so we can talk about the Buddha planting the seeds of poti, of wisdom. We can talk about what we're doing here as we are planting the seeds of poti. Right now, we are planting the seeds of wisdom. But actually, if we use the word we, we're talking quite stupidly. To say we are planting the seeds of wisdom is incorrect and foolish. What's happening is it's just the one mind. The one mind is planting the seeds of wisdom. The one mind is growing in the understanding of dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, and the path that leads to the end of dukkha. There's no we. There's just the one mind developing on the path of poti. So you'll see that everything that's been said today has to do with the ultimate truth of the one mind. This is all we're talking about, the ultimate truth of the one mind. The one mind receives the sense objects, reacts to them in forms of liking and disliking. Then there arises the defilements of greed or anger or confusion. This causes attachment. The one mind attaches. And then the one mind is burdened with this problem of dukkha, this burden which weighs down and causes and makes life difficult to live. This is just the one mind and the conditioning of the one mind. But if we truly begin to understand the truth of the one mind, we see how this dukkha itself begins to condition poti, or wisdom. And then so the mind begins to develop in wisdom. The one mind grows in wisdom. This is all the workings of the one mind. It's just one mind. Now most people will see this thing that we would call defilement, or in Pali, kilesa, which is the light, the trying to pull in, the greed, the pushing away, the anger, and the delusion and confusion, these defilements are seen as opposed to what we call wisdom, or to poti. But those who really understand the mind will see that the defilements, greed, anger, and confusion, are the one mind. And we'll see that wisdom, poti, the knowledge and understanding of the way things truly are, this is also the one mind. If you understand this, then you see that the defilements and wisdom are the same thing, just the one mind. The defilements and wisdom are the one thing. Now listen carefully and understand this properly. Sometimes there are people with very childish understandings of things who listen incompletely and go away with half-baked ideas. Or they start saying, oh, this guy up there is crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But if you're really interested in the way the mind works, then you'll see that defilement and enlightenment is the same thing. The way things are in this world, if somebody says this, they're criticized. As soon as somebody says such a deep truth as defilement and enlightenment are the same thing, then they're criticized from all around. There are all sorts of people ready to jump on this kind of statement. And so in the past, when we have said things like this, we are criticized. But we don't care about the criticisms. We're concerned with truth. And the truth is that there's just the one mind. Defilement and enlightenment are the same thing. The one mind. So this is why we've been talking about this ultimate truth of the one mind. You may understand that the words the one mind and the words the same mind are somewhat different. But really the same mind is just that one mind. And so what we're talking about here is the one mind. When we say that defilement and enlightenment are the same thing, defilement is just a product of the mind, and enlightenment is just a product of that same mind. Defilement is nothing but a conditioning of the mind, and wisdom is just a conditioning of the mind. These are just things that arise out of the one mind. Both defilement and wisdom are just products of the one mind. They're just sankhara, conditioned things. Both defilement is a conditioned thing, and wisdom is a conditioned thing. And so we say they're the same thing, arising out of the one mind. And we have to be careful when we talk in this way, and you will as well. If you go and talk about this to somebody out on the street who doesn't have any understanding of the workings of the mind, they'll accuse you of speaking incorrectly, or they'll say you don't know what you're talking about, or they may even go so far as to say you're crazy. But what we're talking about here, what is being talked about, is the one mind, and the developing of the mind to a state of non-attachment. We're talking about such a refined state of non-attachment that there is no attachment to even defilement, nor is there any attachment to wisdom. There is no attachment whatsoever. And we call this the non-attached mind. Remember, we're not saying the detached mind, because detachment is just another kind of attachment. But non-attachment, the non-attached mind, this is the final goal of Buddhism. This is the most profound truth of the one mind, the non-attached mind. The mind that is not caught up in any concepts or feelings of I or mine. This is the ultimate truth of the one mind. So this is simply a matter of the one mind. Defilement is the one mind. Wisdom is the one mind. Defilement is void, and wisdom is void, because the one mind is void. It is empty of any self or soul, empty of I and mine. Defilement is simply datada, suchness, the state of being thus. Wisdom is simply datada, suchness, the state of being such. The one mind is void, is datada. We'd like to give you a bird's eye view of this entire process from the very beginning to the end. We'll take an overview of the whole thing so that you'll understand what it all involves. We can summarize this as saying, from void to busy, and from busy to void. In Thai, it's very nice. It's from Wang to Wun, and from Wun to Wang. From void to busy, and then from busy to void. The one mind, from void to busy, and then from busy to void. Remember the infant, or remember the embryo in the mother's uterus, the fetus in the womb. The mind of that fetus is Wang, is void. In that mind there are no thoughts or feelings of I or mine. This is the void. But then through the functioning of the sensory apparatus, then there is conditioned defilement. Defilement conditions attachment. And then there is dukkha. So the one mind goes from the state of void to the state of dukkha, of the mind that is busy, agitated, confused. This is Wun, the mind that is busy and complicated and stirred up. The one mind goes from void to busy. But this state of busyness is dukkha. And then the mind begins to learn and grow in poti, in enlightenment wisdom. And this poti develops further and further. And so the one mind moves from the state of busyness, of busy, to the development of wisdom, moves to the state of void. And so we've got this process from void to busy, from busy to void. Or the one mind goes from void to void. Now be careful about these two kinds of void. In the Zen tradition, they talk about discovering the original face. Discovering the original face is talking about that void mind before the starting of all the conditioning. This is true, but in a way it's not completely true. Because if we talk about discovering the original face, that voidness of the original face, of the mind before all the conditioning and dukkha and attachment started, that void is not the same as the final void. This first kind of void, the mind of an infant, that void is a void that can be conditioned. It's the void that can turn into busyness. That's one kind of void. But this other void is a void that is void forever. It is a voidness that is always empty of I and mind. It can no longer, this voidness will never get caught up in the conditioning. And no dukkha will befall the mind that has realized this final void. So we go from one kind of void, the void of the infant's mind, or the fetus's mind, to the void of the enlightened being. Both kinds of void are absent and empty of any thoughts or feelings of I and mine. But the first kind of void can get caught up in the conditioning and caught up in attachment and dukkha. But the latter kind of void, the final void of the enlightened being, of the enlightened citta, is the kind of void that will never be conditioned again, that cannot attach or detach ever again, and is completely free of dukkha. The one mind goes from void to busy, from busy to void, or we can just say from void to void, from emptiness of I and mind to complete and permanent emptiness of I and mind. This is the ultimate truth of the one mind. So from void to busy, from busy to void, or we can just say from void to void. To get from void to void involves a training of the one mind. The one mind must be trained and developed. We described this training yesterday through samadhi, concentration, and panya, wisdom. The mind is developed from void to void. Or we can use the words samatha, tranquility, and vipassana, insight, which mean basically the same thing as concentration and wisdom. Through tranquility and insight, the mind is trained. The mind is developed from void to void. We talked about this quite a bit yesterday. Now what we've just said is a deep truth, but we're going to hit you with something even more profound than that. There is something to talk about from void to busy, and from busy to void, is still speaking what is relative truth. So listen very, very carefully. Give the following words your undivided attention so that you do not confuse them. Don't make a mess of this very profound truth, which we're going to tell you. When we say void and busy, or void and not void, people generally see these as opposites. we want to tell you that void and not void are void. Void and not void are void. This first voidness is void, and not void is void. Void is empty of any I or mine, any self or soul. And what we call not void or busy is also empty of any I or mine. There is nothing in that busyness that you can call a self or a soul. Void is void, and not void is void. Void and not void are void. This is a very profound truth. This is ultimate truth. This is as deep as you can go. Void is void, and not void is void. In all these things we've been talking about today, the infant's mind is empty of any I or mine, any self or soul. There's nothing in there that can be called a self or a soul. And as the feelings arise and the defilements, these defilements are all void. The one mind is void, whether it is void or busy. Sometimes we say the one mind is void. Sometimes we say it is busy. But in the deepest reality, it is always void. There is never anything about the one mind which is a self or a soul. The defilements are void. Attachment is void. Even this attaching to things as I and mind is empty of any self or soul, any atta or atman. Dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness is void. Wisdom is void, and the void is void. The voidness of the fetus and the voidness of the enlightened being are void, are empty of I and mine. There is nothing in there that is a self, a soul, an atta, or an atman. The one mind is void. It's always void. There is nothing but the void mind. This is the ultimate truth. Everything that we talk about in Buddhism is void. When we talk about the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, they're all void. The Buddha is void. The Dhamma is void. The Sangha is void. There's nothing about these triple gems which are self or soul. When we talk about samadhi, concentration, it is void. Wisdom is void. Tranquility is void. Insight is void. Morality is void. All this training of the one mind, this development of the one mind is void. The one mind is essentially void. Whether it is void or busy, it is void. I hope you've been listening carefully and that you don't confuse this. Because if you confuse this point and don't understand it properly, you can cause yourself problems. So understand what you are being told in the correct way, and then you'll be able to use this knowledge to realize voidness. The mind, when a mind realizes this essential voidness of everything, we say that is Tathagata. The being who is known as the Buddha referred to himself as the Tathagata, which means one who has entered into the void, one who has attained or realized the void. The one mind can be Tathagata, can realize the void, the utter emptiness of self or soul. This is the state of being such. This is the state of being thus. The void is thus. It is this state of being just that. This is Tathata, and Tathagata is the mind that has realized the Tathata of the void. Please understand this. Everything, from defilement through wisdom, from void to busy, and from busy to void, all of it is purely void. So everything is void. Even the highest thing in Buddhism, which is Nibbana, is void. Everything is void. The things which are conditioned, the sankhara, and things which are not conditioned, which are visankhara. Whether things are conditioned or not conditioned, they are all void. Ignorance is void. Enlightenment is void. Everything is empty of self and soul. You cannot find anything that can legitimately be called a self or a soul. There is nothing which can be attached to. It is all just void. มากไปจำไม่ได้
ก็ทุกอย่างว่อยอีแต่นั้น condition or non condition ว่อย
ครับ
มีแต่เรื่องของจิตสิ่งเดียวไม่มีเรื่องของคนอื่นแม้เราจะพูดว่าตนมันหมายถึงจิต
ครับ
ตนหมายถึงจิตไม่มีตนที่แท้จริง
So it's all void. It's all a matter of this one mind, the same mind. The same mind gets caught up in defilement. The same mind realizes voidness. That mind is essentially void, is always void. That defilement is void, and that enlightenment is void. So we talk about we must do this, we must do that. We must do this practice, we must realize the void. But really talking like this is still stupid. It's still talking about we and I, and is still caught up in attachment. To speak properly, we have to say that we is the one mind. We is that same mind. It is the mind which must be trained. The mind must train itself. The mind must develop. The mind must realize voidness. It is that mind that is stupid, that is foolish, that is caught up in ignorance and attaches and brings down dukkha upon it. It is the same mind which develops and trains and realizes voidness, realizes nibbana. It's the same mind, and it is all essentially void. So sometimes we may use the word we to help for people who have never heard this kind of talk. But to use the word we is still to not understand. It is best to say the one mind, the same mind, trains and realizes voidness. Because that same mind is void, always. It is eternally void. Even the illusion of not void, the illusion of attachment, all of that is still void. The one mind is always void. And so we have to be careful about saying we. But those of you who have heard this saying, self is the refuge of self, may wonder, is this true? It is true. Self is the refuge of self. This means that the one mind must depend upon the one mind. The one mind cannot go and depend on anything else. The one mind must depend on the one mind. It is the one mind that gets caught up in attachment in dukkha. It is the one mind that begins to understand that dukkha, understand the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, and the way of living to realize the end of dukkha, to realize the void. It's the same mind, and that same mind must find its refuge in the same mind. There is no other refuge. So to say the self is the refuge of self, that self is void. Both selves are void. It's just a way of talking. There is no reality there is of any self or soul or I or mine, because it is merely just the one mind. The one mind takes refuge in the one mind. So you've heard this word, the self, over and over again. And we keep saying that there is no self. We keep talking about anatta. But then you hear something like, the self is the refuge of self. To help you understand what we're talking about, we'll point out three different kinds of self. When we use the word self, it can have three different meanings. So we'll go through these three meanings of self or of soul, so you can see exactly what we're talking about. The first kind of self is the ignorant feeling that arises in the mind. It is the ignorant illusion that there is some kind of permanent entity, some kind of eternal person or soul or atta or atman. This ignorant feeling in the mind is the first kind of self. The second kind of self is the real self, the genuine true self, which is that there is no self. The second kind of self is the realization that there is no reality to this word, the self. The word, the self, does not point to anything that actually exists. This is the second meaning, the real meaning of self. The third meaning of self is the kind of self that can be used to eliminate dukkha. When we talk about self as the refuge of self, we're talking about this third kind of self which can be used, which can train and develop along the path of poti, along the path of enlightenment wisdom. This is the kind of self that can be used and trained for the elimination of dukkha, for the elimination of the self, for the realization of the fundamental reality of voidness. So these are the three kinds of self. We mention them so that you can separate them and distinguish between them so that you will not be confused. The first self is that of the illusion within the mind. The second is the reality that there is no such thing as a self or soul, atta or atman. The third self is that self which can be developed and trained to realize the ultimate state of voidness, the end of dukkha. Everything that we've talked about is about the mind. And so in a way we could call it psychology, the study of the mind. It would not be really wrong to call this psychology, but what has happened these days is what is commonly called psychology has been completely possessed by materialism. What is called psychology is always being used for material interests. It's being used in advertising, helping corporations make money, and to win friends and influence people, and for reasons of sex and other materialistic endeavors. This is the state of what is normally called psychology. So we really don't want to call this psychology. So we'll add a word and call it Buddhist psychology or spiritual psychology to differentiate between the kind of psychology which is caught up in materialism and greed. So this is Buddhist psychology, the workings and understanding of the truth of the one mind. The Buddha said that if someone understands the truth, that the mind is void, and then it is conditioned by defilement and then becomes void again. The Buddha said if someone understands this transformation from void to defilement to void, if this is understood, then it is possible for that person, that mind, to practice mental development, or what is commonly called meditation, or some people use the word vipassana meditation. But if one does not understand this truth of how the mind works, if one does not understand that it is the one mind that changes from void to defilement to void, if this is not understood, there can be no mental development. There can be no citta bhavana. That means it is impossible to meditate. If you do not grasp this truth, then what you are doing is not meditation. To meditate, one must understand this transformation of the mind. The mind is originally void. It becomes defiled. The defilement passes away, and there is once again the state of void. We hope that you can understand this so that you will be able to meditate properly, so that the citta, the mind, will be developed correctly. So we can summarize this all by, if you're asked the question, who is who? You can answer, it's just the same mind. It's all the same mind. Who is who? It's all the same mind. All these different functions and activities and shapes and colors of mind is all the same mind. The same mind can be developed and trained so that it stops attaching. It becomes free of attachment. And then that same mind is developed to the highest possible knowledge. This is what this is about, developing and training the mind for the realization of the highest knowledge. The knowledge that brings about the elimination of dukkha. So if you're asked who is who, the answer is it's all the same mind that can realize the highest truth. Who experiences dukkha, or who has all these problems of dukkha? Who wants or needs to extinguish dukkha? Who studies Buddhism in order to extinguish dukkha? Who is practicing Dhamma? Who is able to extinguish dukkha? Who experiences the taste of extinguishing dukkha, that is nibbana? The answer to all these questions is it's all the same mind which can change in all these different forms. So the most marvelous and amazing and fantastic thing in the entire universe is this marvelous and fantastic ability of the mind to know itself, to know its problems, and to want to overcome those problems. This one ability, this fact of the mind, is the most marvelous thing in the entire universe. And even further, it's most marvelous that this mind is able to control itself. This mind can master itself and train itself. It can develop itself and practice the Dhamma. This is incredibly marvelous, that this mind is able to control itself, train itself, and develop itself. And an even higher level of marvelousness is that this mind is able to transform itself from a mind that has dukkha to a mind that is free of dukkha. It changes from an old life that is burdened by dukkha to a new life that has no dukkha at all. This is the supreme marvelousness of the thing we call the citta. And it's always, continually, the same mind. In some other places they teach that there are many, many different minds. They have long lists and numbers attached to these lists of all the different minds. But we don't talk like that. We don't say that there are many different minds. We say that there is just one mind, the same mind. It's all the same mind. So this is the ultimate secret of the thing that is called the single mind, the one mind. And we'll end today's talk with this secret.